Ladies and gentlemen, we are live, as this is the main event you've all been waiting for. Brought to you by Axonius, the cybersecurity asset management company. It's time!
Bridgecrew is the all-in-one cloud security platform for developers. Bridgecrew analyzed thousands of open source Helm charts to bring you the newly released State of Helm Security Research Report. Learn their security insights and more at bridgecrew.io/CSP. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Virtual Coffee with Ashish. I get excited about these end of month episodes because I get to have friends over and they take over the podcast, and I can just sit in the backstage and just listen to these amazing people talk. So today's topic, without further ado, is what is cyber resiliency in cloud? And I've got a Resilient Cyber podcast here, and I've got two amazing people sitting backstage. Let me just bring them over 1 second. Hello.
Hey.
So Dr. Nikki and Chris Hughes, welcome to the show. And I'm so grateful that you accepted the invite. And I'm also excited that you're going to educate the Cloud Security Podcast audience about cyber resiliency. But before we get into that, and before I just take my hand off the rein and just give it over to you guys, folks, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure.
Nikki.
Okay. So I'm Dr. Nikki Robinson. I am a security architect by day and an adjunct professor by night. Got my DSC in cybersecurity, specialize in vulnerability management, vulnerability chaining, risk management, all that good stuff. And that's kind of me.
And then Chris Hughes here, about 20 years roughly in cybersecurity, mostly in cloud security, the last like several years, I'd say 6 or 7 years at this point. Working in the public sector in the United States for federal agencies, Department of Defense, as well as commercial industry. I also teach as an adjunct at a couple of different universities in the United States, and pretty passionate about all things cloud security. Staying involved with groups like Cloud Security Alliance, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and other groups like that.
Awesome, and I think you should also mention that you're our guest from season 1 as well. So there's an episode for that as well. That's right. Once this gets live, I'm gonna put that over there on the corner for people to go on to. But so cyber resiliency, and I am excited about this, and I want you to get into this as well. So I'm gonna go to the backstage, and I will see all of you in a bit. But oh my God, Zenith loves it. By the way, Zenith just yay! Chris, Dr. Nikki, Ashish in one screen, super.
Oh,
so,
thank you.
Hi Zenith. Hi Vineet as well. There you go. Perfect. So we've got people joining in as well. So I would love for them to get value straight off. And I will see you folks in a bit. Over to you.
Sounds good.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to say thanks for having us on. You mentioned the podcast and being a guest. Part of my cloud learning journey, honestly, has been following this show and just the diverse, the guests that you've had on, the range of expertise and insights. I've learned an incredible amount just by listening to the show. So I'm always honored to get the chance to come on, being a longtime listener and fan of the show myself.
Awesome,
yeah,
man.
For sure.
Thank you. All right. Over to you, folks.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, so I guess we're going to kind of take it away. We've got a couple different topics we're going to talk about with cloud security. Do you want to talk a little bit about the podcast first? We can talk a little bit about the Resilient Cyber podcast.
Yeah, definitely. Ironically enough, again, somewhat inspired by Ashish, he had an episode with the folks from Hacker Valley Studio. I feel like it was, and another individual. I think his name is Chris, who's a CISO as well. And they were throwing out the idea of like why others should look into starting a podcast, and that's what got me thinking about it. And then I knew Dr. Nikki, and I've seen some of her work and seen her thoughts around some topics, and I was really interested in having a co-host. So I didn't have to do this all by myself like Ashish does. So I reached out to Dr. Nikki, and that's where we kind of founded the idea of the Resilient Cyber podcast. We're coming up on like our last few episodes actually of season 1. We have 22 or 23 episodes live, 22 I think it is.
Yep.
We'll have a couple more to go, and yeah, it's been an adventure, and I've learned so much just listening and talking to folks. And I don't know about you, but it's really been a great experience.
Oh, 100%. Like I remember when he brought this idea to me, and I was like, oh my gosh, yes, this would be amazing. And just getting to talk about, like we're going to talk about cloud AWS security here today, but getting to talk about all kinds of topics and sort of bringing them into AWS security today. I'm pretty excited about that too. So do we want to take it away? We can sort of talk about our first kind of topic here.
For sure. Let's do it.
All right. So we wanted to hit you guys with a couple of different topics. So first, we wanted to talk about resiliency. That's sort of what we're known for, what we talk a lot about on our podcast. So we wanted to talk about what that kind of means in AWS security and in the cloud. So Chris, what do you think some of the key considerations, some of the most important things that we kind of need to consider when we're designing systems specifically for resiliency in the cloud?
Yeah, definitely. And some of these aspects that I'm going to touch on are not necessarily cloud or AWS specific, but I am going to talk about how cloud is unique in the regard of building resilient systems, basically. But some of the core concepts that definitely keep in mind are going to be concepts such as RTO, RPO, and service level agreements. So RTO is essentially the recovery time objective. That's how much time a system can be inoperable, based to a disruption or some kind of incident of some sort before you have to restore it and get it back functioning and your business doesn't suffer like an irrecoverable incident, essentially. And then same thing on the RPO front is how much data can you afford to lose before an operation becomes inoperable or irrecoverable for your organization and starts to damage you to a point where you can't recover from. And then service level agreements are something I throw out there because any organization that's operating, whether you have internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, you likely have some kind of service level agreements in place. How quickly you need to restore services, essentially. And that's something to keep in mind when you're building on AWS and in the cloud. So as far as AWS and building resilient systems go, AWS essentially thinks of like RPO and RTO and disaster recovery as part of the broader concept of business continuity and business continuity planning, right? Which is maintaining operations for your organization, throughout disruptions or incidents that may occur. And they kind of think of it through their lens of 4 different frames, they have what's called backup and restore, pilot light, warm standby, and then multi-site active. And each of those different architectures or deployments are kind of dictated based on, like I said, your RPO, your RTO, and your SLAs. So think of like backup and restore as just having a backup of your data, right, that you can restore from. And you don't have any services running in a different region or availability zone. And I definitely want to dive into that a bit because in AWS, what's different about this than on-premise infrastructures is AWS operates, their architecture in a sense that they have what's called availability zones. It's kind of a collection of data centers in a geographical region, and they call that an availability zone. Like they may have US East 1, for example. Then they also have a broader concept, a bigger concept called regions. So you have a collection of availability zones essentially, and these all kind of form together to create like fault isolation zones. And you can architect your services, your systems appropriately based on those concepts. But going on from the backup and restore point, on from that, it would be the concept of a pilot light. So instead of just like having data backed up and nothing running anywhere else, you may have some core services running in place in another availability zone, for example, or another region, but just your core services. It may take some time to bring things back up and get things back online. And then moving on from that is what you would call like a warm standby. That's where you have even more services, your business critical services are running in a different region or different availability zone, for example, and you're able to restore them much quicker. And then ultimately at the, kind of the peak maturity, if you have like the most intense RPO, RTO, or service level agreements, you'd have like a multi-site active deployment. So you have your services running in not just one region or availability zone, but multiple regions and availability zones. And that's so that, even if you have like some kind of geographical incident that takes out US East 1, you can stay stable, stay functioning. Maybe you have some degradation of service or something like that, but you're ultimately staying functioning for your customers. And that's kind of the way to think about it. With that said, each of those come with their own cost, right? How quickly you want to be able to restore, how resilient you want your system to be is going to have a cost associated with it. So that's all kind of key considerations for people to take into account as they approach resiliency on AWS.
Yeah, I think that's I think those are great points. And especially because when we talk about resiliency now, we talk about it a lot differently than we used to when we talked about on-prem. We talked about like a warm site and a hot site and a cold site, things like that. So kind of in that on-premise versus cloud flavor, how do you think DR and business continuity are really different? I mean, we hit a couple of them, but different than on-premise.
Yeah, there's definitely some significant differences. A couple like I talked about is just like that geographical redundancy that AWS offers their customers, right? And this is all for the same for leading cloud service providers. I do want to add, not just AWS, but if I'm a small business, for example, and I need to have geographical redundancy on both coasts of the United States, what would it cost me to have data centers in those locations fully functional with power and utilities and everything needed to kind of restore operations, or even have fully resilient multi-site operations underway, right? It would be incredibly expensive. But if I'm using the cloud and using AWS, I can leverage those services for a much more affordable price because they kind of have economies of scale in that regard. If they do this for, thousands and thousands of organizations, thousands of customers, and you're able to, take advantage of that as a small business or any organization of any size, honestly. Some other aspects that are unique to the cloud is the kind of evolution that we've seen of moving towards infrastructure as code. No longer do you have to have physical server racks where you're standing up equipment. You're plugging things in, running cables, getting everything running in that sense. You can have essentially a code, a repository of your architecture of your systems that can quickly be taken and restored and deployed into another environment. Within AWS, or even if you're using say you're using a vendor agnostic approach like Terraform, for example, you could even take that and deploy into another cloud service provider entirely if you needed to. Say AWS had some kind of major incident where they were fully inoperable and trying to take that infrastructure as code and deploy into another cloud service provider even. So that's another major distinction and difference between traditional on-premise technology.
Right. The ability to sort of lift and shift and move quickly.
Yeah.
So what are the kind of based on that when we're talking about DR and recovery? What kind of recovery options are available when we're talking about AWS specifically for DR?
Yeah, that's actually what I touched on earlier in regards to, I kind of jumped ahead of you there, but that's what I touched on earlier in regards to the 4 tiers of maturity or different levels of restoration, right? From backup and restore, pilot light, warm standby, or multi-site deployments. And that's kind of the way that AWS views that, that resiliency or reliability aspect of their operations. And then, something to highlight too, with regards to the cloud that I wanted to mention before, I forgot when you said what's unique to the cloud versus on-premise. Is cloud, you can't ever have the conversation of cloud without discussing the shared responsibility model. If you're on premise, you're kind of, unless you have a data center, colo kind of scenario where you have data center operations provided by a third party, in the cloud, you have the shared responsibility model. So AWS is ultimately responsible for that physical infrastructure, those facilities, the utilities, fire, concerns, all those kind of things that you traditionally would have to do yourself. You have the shared responsibility model now, where the cloud service provider is responsible for a core set of these services, and then you, as well as a consumer, I should say, are responsible for some of those as well. So that's something to keep in mind with cloud that's different, is knowing, in the case of an incident, in the case of interruption of some sort, what is the cloud service provider responsible for? What are they going to maintain and keep up and running? And what are service level agreements around that? Going back to the SLAs again. And then, me as a cloud service consumer, what am I responsible for? And then what kind of requirements do I have based on my business requirements, internally or externally to customers and things of that nature that I need to make sure I'm able to meet?
So what I'm kind of hearing is there are plenty of opportunities, plenty of options available, lots of different services and types of models that you can use when you're kind of either building in the AWS or any cloud, but a lot of considerations that you have to sort of understand when you're considering DR, business continuity, kind of what data is most important, what services and systems are most important, kind of when you're either moving to the cloud or you're already in the cloud, but you still need to consider those things.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a multifaceted in the sense that it's a maturity scenario where as you get more mature in your cloud adoption and migration and journey, you can start to, kind of move up towards maybe, having that multi-site deployment architecture kind of scenario, or maybe, it's dictated by your business requirements. Like I said, some organizations, they can handle more downtime than others without it being critical and, negatively impacting the organization, whether it's financially, operationally, think of medical organizations, for example, critical financial industry type stuff. That's all going to be different for each organization. And then, something else I want to touch on there is as you mature into your, your disaster recovery, your business continuity, and moving towards resiliency, is the concept of, tabletop exercises, or even more, as we're starting to hear about, is chaos engineering. Going into your environment and intentionally causing disruption and causing things to go wrong, because you don't want to run to a scenario where something happens and you're like, oh, well, we thought, we had this in place. What's going on? Why are we not? We should be good, right? No, we've never tested it. We've never, kind of tested the resiliency of our systems. And that's where I think tabletop exercises, and then even beyond tabletop, just, obviously is hypothetical. Chaos engineering is much more practical and hands-on, where it's going to go in there and it's going to disrupt some things. And you want to make sure you have that sustained, resiliency. You want to make sure you have that resilient system in place that can respond to these incidents, whether it's known or unknown type things that may occur.
Yeah, I have to just quick note when you mentioned chaos engineering. When I heard this term recently, like within the last few weeks, and I was like, what is this? I need to investigate this because I was like, what a cool job. It's sort of how we think about pen testers, right? That they're in there to sort of figure out what's going to go wrong.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I love that.
To you and the audience, check out something called Chaos Monkey. I think it was, open source by Netflix, if I'm not mistaken, that they created basically to do this kind of thing. Imagine trying to provide services to, millions of customers at scale like they do. You need to make sure like you don't have interruptions, like things stay functional. And it's really a new kind of unique space that's emerging. I think it's going to grow and grow with organizations as they start testing the resiliency of their systems, honestly.
Interesting.
Yeah. So from there, let's move on to our next section and we had set up to discuss, which is vulnerability management in the cloud. I know vulnerability management is always a topic on top of mind for you. As we move to the cloud, I feel like we do talk about a lot of topics, like as I just talked about, infrastructure as code and, shared responsibility model and all these kind of things. But vulnerability management doesn't get a lot of conversation. I feel like quite as much as it used to. Why do you feel like we don't talk about vulnerability management as much in the cloud?
Yeah, this is great. This is something I really wanted to talk about when I knew that we would sort of be doing this takeover episode, because vulnerability management is not, it's not an exciting topic. It's not something super fun that people like love to talk about. Like they don't want to talk about their hundreds of critical vulnerabilities. It's just not something they want to do. So I think part of it is that. I think the other part is there was this misconception, it was several years ago, and maybe it still exists in some small pockets today, but that vulnerability management wasn't really a concern when you moved to the cloud, that it was like, oh, well, we're putting everything in the cloud. It's not a problem anymore. We don't have to worry about patches and things like that. And I was like, oh, no, that's not what that means. It depends on your model, right? Like your service model that you choose, that you may be responsible for some of that. If you're using SaaS, probably not. But if you are using platform as a service or infrastructure as a service, you need to understand kind of what you're responsible for. So you need to understand, is the OS level my responsibility? Is the application layer my responsibility? Is it not? So that way you can sort of figure out, do I need a patch? How am I going to patch? What does my system look like in general, right? So am I using VMs? Am I using containers? How am I actually building my environment? So I think it's not really talked about because people, it's kind of an older terminology. And so people are kind of like, it's just patches. And as we talk about this a little bit more, it's like, nope, vulnerability management is not just patch management. It's secure configuration. It's looking at settings and controls. Like going back to Active Directory days, like we're talking about group policy, we're talking about settings, like we're talking about real settings within the system, IAM. So it's a huge bucket.
That's actually something I was glad you highlighted, is because a lot of folks think of vulnerability management through the lens of patching, like you said. And just, to touch on a couple of things you brought up, there are the scenarios where you can take advantage of the cloud service offerings. Like AWS has AWS Systems Manager, or Patch Manager it's called. And you can basically schedule routine updates to your AMIs or instances that you have in your environment and schedule patches to occur on a certain time interval that works for you as an organization, for example. Or you can lean into, PaaS and SaaS offerings and basically alleviate some of that aspect of patch management, at least to your organization as well, which is a great option for smaller organizations without core competencies around patching and IT operations and things like that.
Right.
Definitely some things worth highlighting. And then you mentioned configurations, and that's like critical. Is moving to the cloud, it's basically been proven that the overwhelming number of cloud data breaches and data leaks are due to customer misconfigurations.
Yeah.
So you need to have make sure you have secure configurations in place. Make sure you're working with the right folks at your organization, whether you're hiring them, upskilling the existing workforce, bringing in external advisors, whatever the case is. Because if you don't, you can definitely put your organization at risk.
For sure. And you hit on like an important point there where we're talking about secure configuration, and it is consistently security misconfiguration is in the OWASP top 10. And in the last version was number 6 in the OWASP top 10, that it's just, it's secure misconfiguration across the board, but I'm sure we've heard our fair share of S3 buckets that maybe were misconfigured. So, it can happen. And so it's something to sort of be aware of and be conscious of as part of the vulnerability management kind of process.
Yeah, absolutely. The insecure buckets is definitely one that's gotten many of folks. And then, that's where I think in the cloud paradigm, we're seeing a lot like a new focus on more modern tooling, like, cloud security posture management. I know this is something that Ashish actually had someone on that talked about recently, is like CSPM, cloud security posture management, CWPP, cloud workload protection whatever. I forget all the acronyms, but you see,
There's a couple.
there's a lot more modern cloud native tooling in place around security and
Yeah.
vulnerabilities and things that need to be taken advantage of. So on that
Well-
front, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna add on that too, that there are a lot of really great things that you can leverage if you're moving to the cloud, or if you are, starting all of your systems, beginning your systems cloud native, starting there, then that's great too. There are a lot of things that are available, a lot of tools, a lot of configurations. It's just about sort of being aware of them, that they do exist, and that you might have to learn how to configure them differently than you would with systems on-prem.
Yeah, and there's a lot of unique things you can do in this regard. Like, I talked about infrastructure as code in the beginning. And I know Ashish had a sponsor named Bridge Crew. You can go out and you can leverage, open source, infrastructure as code from repositories that are out there to help you get things up and running much more quicker. But
yeah,
there may be vulnerabilities in those that you're not aware of. And it's like, oh, this is so much faster. Yes, but now you've just, put yourself in a very vulnerable situation. And that's where tooling like Bridge Crew, for example, and others comes into play. Another thing I really am a fan of with regards to the cloud is creating things such as, golden AMIs, like golden images. We've all heard of golden images, but having those golden images kind of around, secured and up to snuff with your organization requirements, whether it's like a CIS benchmark or whatever the case is, hardened, so you can take it and deploy that on an on-demand situation, basically.
100%. And when you're doing security assessments, or you're doing continuous monitoring, things like that, you sort of have that configured baseline, these sort of controls that are supposed to be in place. And it's very similar to what you would be doing on-prem that you would be in cloud, is just basically making sure that those secure configurations are still there, that nothing changed. And that if something does need to change, it goes through the proper change controls, to make sure that it gets put in place. But that baseline is constantly updated to make sure that, yes, it is using whatever the latest version might be, latest patches, any of that good stuff, that would all be there in the baseline. And it makes it so much easier just for administrative overhead purposes.
Yeah, I'd say that's like definitely a more mature way of approaching vulnerability management and secure configurations and posture in the cloud. I did want to ask one last question before we move on, if we didn't touch on it already, but what are something you say that, security professionals can do to mature their vulnerability management programs, in the cloud context?
For sure. Yeah. So containers, I think containers are a really, really great step forward, from virtualization, from VMs, where you're like having a VM template, you have, a container now where you're sort of virtualizing that OS layer, which is fantastic. I love that. So I think that there are a lot of benefits to using containers. Again, you still have some security configurations and some settings that you need to make sure are in place. But I would say logging and monitoring. If you can really get your alerting down, if you can really get your logging set up properly, it makes life so much easier. You have fewer alerts that you have to watch for. When you've got those baselines, you have sort of tailored out alerts that you don't have to look at anymore, when you kind of know, like, hey, this is expected kind of security and expected functionality. And if something deviates, then I get like a real alert. So I would say kind of making sure you're focused on logging and continuous monitoring, and always being on the lookout for different types of security tooling within AWS. They're constantly evolving and changing. And so I think keeping up to date with kind of what's going on in the cloud, whatever cloud deployment you may have, just kind of keeping up to date with what they're doing, because they're constantly evolving and changing and improving.
Yeah, I can't emphasize that enough. Just to kind of add to what you said there, is like leaning into some of those native services. Like, obviously it's not going to cover every situation, cover all your use case requirements, that kind of thing, but leaning into those native services, CloudWatch, CloudTrail, utilizing AWS Security Hub. I love recommending folks use Security Hub and run they have built-in benchmarks you can run across your environments for CIS benchmarks, for AWS security best practices, running those across your environments and seeing how you're doing. And there's also a lot of open source, things out there such as Prowler, Cloud Custodian. There's tons and tons of resources. And I know previous guests like Scott Piper and others that Ashish has had on have talked about that. So with that said, I know our last kind of discussion area is AWS certifications. So you want to touch on that?
Yeah. So we wanted to sort of talk about certifications because, especially for AWS and a number of the other cloud providers as well, but for AWS, their certification sort of roadmap has sort of exploded in the last few years. There are a number of different, because it's become so huge, there's a number of different ways that you can sort of go in AWS. So we sort of wanted to hit on this from a practical standpoint. If anybody's interested in getting into AWS or learning more, specifically from the security standpoint, what is kind of, where should they start, Chris? What should they look at?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be open to sharing my journey, right? When I first started off with AWS, didn't have the cloud practitioner certification. I don't think it didn't exist yet, but AWS kind of constructs their certifications in different tiers. They have what's the associate level, which has AWS Solution Architect Associate, SysOps, and then also the developer certification as well. And then below that, they have AWS CCP, the Cloud Certified Practitioner. That's like the entry-level cert. So definitely a great place to start if you're not familiar with cloud and AWS, is that CCP certification. Then going beyond that, they have their professional level certifications, which is DevOps Professional and Solution Architect Professional. And then they also have specialty tracks, as you said. It kind of really the specialty track has really expanded quite a bit. Things such as networking, security, machine learning. There's so many different specialties. I don't even know them all.
Yeah, there's a networking specialty now too. Yeah.
I'll say from my perspective, I have 8 AWS certifications. I start off just like thinking, hey, like I need to learn about cloud and AWS security. I'll take the Solution Architect Associate and then security, and that'll be it. But here I am, 8 certifications later. Right. I was like, well, what about networking? Or what about developer? What about DevOps? What about Solution Architect Pro? But I think a lot of people, get overwhelmed when they first look at it. Like, I can't learn all this. There's so much. I'll say several things on that front is like, don't be discouraged to learn, kind of fail along the way. I failed the Solution Architect Associate exam once. I failed the Solution Architect Professional exam once. I failed the networking exam once. I hold all those exams now. I've had things come up like throughout the process that was incredibly stressful. Like I failed once and then I went back to take the exam and I lost power at the facility I was testing at halfway through the exam. So you're stressed, like, you just want to pass. You failed once already. The facility lost power. I had to leave. It didn't save my progress. I had to come back and take the exam again for a third time.
Oh, that's brutal.
Yeah. So, but, and also throughout that process, like it all builds on each other. Like, so the things I was learning, from this associate level, like built on, the professional level built on that. And then things I was learning from the specialties, for example, contributed to things that I had to know for the professional level and vice versa. So don't be hesitant to jump into that. Like, and one thing I'll say is like, don't also be hesitant to get hands-on. I know it's something that you wanted to stress is getting hands-on with your learning. You can read and read, but unless you get in those in virtual environments, create instances, play with the native security services. If you don't have, especially if you don't have an opportunity and on the hand, on the job training and experience, get in those virtual lab environments and learn.
Yeah.
And use those sites. There's so many sites like, A Cloud Guru, Pluralsight, Udemy, so many different sites out there with video courses, hands-on labs, so many ways you can learn. So don't hesitate to get out there and just, get experience like that.
Yeah, 100%. I have to echo that because I think it's one of those things being in security in general. I think the more hands-on you can be with the actual environment that you're securing, really understanding what those configuration settings look like, what box you need to check, those types of things. Like, I think those are so important because from a security standpoint, I need to understand what I'm recommending. So if I'm telling you to check that box, I need to understand what that means, functionality and security. So I'm a big believer in that too. Just getting hands-on with the tooling, the products, understanding what they are, what they mean, the different levels that you can get. Because a lot of the in-house sort of AWS security products have different tiers. So understanding what those different tiers mean, what you get at each tier, what's manual, what's automated, what support level you have, things like that. I think those are super crucial to understanding not just the certifications, but really how to use the technology and make sure that when you're making recommendations, because the last thing we want to do as security is say like, oh yeah, just check that box. That's totally fine. And then they check the box and then everything breaks. That's the last thing we want to do. So,
Yeah, I also want to throw a nod out to like, also be open to, learning vendor agnostic certifications. Like before I jumped into the AWS certifications that I've pursued, the first certification around cloud I ever got was the CCSP through ISC Squared, the Certified Cloud Security Professional Exam. And that kind of laid the groundwork for me around shared responsibility, cloud computing. What is cloud computing? Like, what are some of the key security considerations in the cloud around like encryption and key management, key ownership, all these different, things that you want to look at from a security perspective. That exam really helped. And then there's also the CCSK, which is from the Cloud Security Alliance, which is another great one, a kind of vendor agnostic baseline, security certification. And then they also have one that's very new that I've actually been reading about and studying a little bit myself and, throwing around the idea of taking a test, but I don't need any more tests, but
I don't know. What are you, busy or something?
Yeah, I'll probably end up taking it. I know, but it's the CCAK, which is the Certified Cloud Auditing knowledge or something like that. It stands for.
Yes.
Basically, it's like to bring, because auditors are a key part of like the security environment around compliance and third party attestation, all that kind of thing. Auditors need to be familiar with cloud and cloud computing too. So that's definitely a certain certification I think they should look to.
Yeah, and I'd love to, I want to echo what you're saying because, I certainly, from the academic standpoint, I think it is really important to understand sort of the theoretical, the baseline knowledge, sort of understanding that sort of foundational terminology and concepts, because you can help apply those to whatever cloud, a provider you may end up using. That you might have different terminology you need to learn or different, levels to sort of understand within there. But at least if you have that foundational knowledge, you can sort of leverage that into whatever cloud environment you may end up in. So I think that's a really important point.
That's spot on. Is like, definitely there's nuance between Azure and AWS and Google Cloud, for example, but the fundamental concepts are the same. They tend to stay the same, around, the core services and the things that you need to think of from a security perspective tend to stay the same across the various cloud providers. So you're definitely spot on in that regard.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the one other piece of advice that I wanted to provide for anybody who's considering going for either AWS certifications or anything like that, don't be too scared to take it. Just go take it, because I failed the first time I took the AWS cloud practitioner exam as well, because I was like, I only had 2 weeks to study and I had scheduled the test and then I went to take it. And I think I missed it by like one question or something. And I was so bummed. But don't be afraid to just take it. That's okay, right? Like, it's okay to fail and then go back and take it again when you're ready to take it again. But
I just wanted to agree with that, because like I said, I failed AWS exams I think 3 times now between like the 8 exams that I've taken, and like you build it up in your head about this huge deal, like I don't want people to know I failed, like I suck, I can't learn this, I'm not smart enough, whatever you're telling yourself.
Right.
It's nonsense. And I'll say, like, not only that, but like having failed and then went back, like I know the material even better than I did the first time. Like
Absolutely.
I know it really well now because I had to go back and study more, work harder, and do more labbing and things like that. So don't be afraid to fail. It's all part of the journey.
Yeah, for sure. 100%. 100%.
Yeah. So that takes us to our end of our interview, end of our takeover of Ashish's podcast. So definitely, I just want to personally say thank you to Ashish and the audience.
Yeah, huge thank you.
Yeah, huge fan of the show.
Yes.
Well, I was loving the conversation about how both of you became resilient by giving more certifications, no matter how many times you got failed. It opened me up to be open about my thing as well. So I failed the AWS professional one the first time.
Yeah.
And this was after working in cloud for 4 years.
Yeah.
You would think that 4 years of working in AWS, I got this. Like the first time I remember walking in, I'm like, I don't even know why they asked me to do this. I'm just gonna walk in and I'll be walking out.
Yeah.
Those 3 hours was like the most tense hours of my life.
Yep.
It's super hard exam. You need to know like almost every AWS service that there is with that exam. And then I also think it's part of the society we live in. Like we have a highlight reel with LinkedIn or whatever. We're like, oh, another person passed another test. I feel like the story of us failing is definitely more common than you hear about, because like people aren't comfortable sharing it. Just there shouldn't be anything big or crazy about it. Just like if you fail, it's okay. Go back and learn again.
Yeah, exactly. Just keep trying, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And I think I love how it kind of comes back to the theme of the conversation as well, because when you're trying to build resilient systems, just what you both have been talking about, it is you're preparing for failure. You're not preparing for what a successful system would look like. We're all preparing for what if shit goes down. What are we gonna do? Like, are we gonna be okay? Are we gonna be resilient? I loved the conversation, and I was following it along, and I personally had a couple of questions. I think we had about 60 people watching at the same time, so that was pretty awesome. And I think a few of them came online as well. Over here to leave a few comments. But the question that I had, and I loved what you guys did with vulnerability management as well, where it was not just about patching. I'm so thankful that you said it's not just about patching.
Yes.
It's like every time I talk about this to anyone else, like, oh, I've got patching covered. I'm like, no, that's not what we're talking about. But sure, let's talk about the next data breach. But I guess the question is to both of you and whoever wants to answer. What's a maturity scale that you would say for resiliency? Like I'm considering myself to be, I guess we have people who are startups based out of different countries. We've got people who are mature organizations as well. And you guys touched on different topics. If I were to start today and go, okay, what should I go first? like vulnerability management, blue green, or what am I doing? So I would give, because I think based on knowledge that both of you have given so much, so I would love to give them some direction on where can they start today, and if they were to kind of start from startup to becoming like a big company, what would you both recommend? Whoever wants to take it.
Yeah. Do you want me to go, Nikki, and then you go, or vice versa? Either
No,
way.
yeah, go ahead, and then I'll go after you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just would, this could be a lengthy conversation, but a couple key like considerations and recommendations I would throw out is like, configurations is huge in the cloud. There's so many different, nuanced configurations you can make that really can come back to bite you. So that's why I mentioned like looking into things like a Security Hub and using CIS Benchmark, their scan through Security Hub, AWS Security Foundation scanning through Security Hub, using native services like Trusted Advisor. It's going to go out there and tell you some of these things that you have wrong that you should definitely take a look at, around like your root account and just basic configuration things that can really come back to bite you. And then also from the workload perspective, is starting with like a secure baseline, using a CIS benchmark or DoD NIST STIG, for example, if you're in the Department of Defense or federal government in the United States, whatever kind of regulatory things you can lean into to have like a hardened baseline, start with that. And you can even look to pull some of these things from the AWS marketplace, for example. They have things out there that you can take advantage of to help harden and speed up your deployment processes. So that's some of the key considerations I'll throw out there.
Yeah, and I would say, just to sort of add on there, I would highly recommend pulling up a chair for security at the beginning, at the very, very beginning. Have someone who's a security SME, whether it's a CISO or a consultant or somebody that you bring in to help you understand risk management as a whole, not necessarily just vulnerability management, but understanding your risk as a whole. And they can help sort of give you a guideline, a maturity model that you can use to say, hey, these are your assets. These are your most important assets. This is what resiliency means to you, because resiliency is really subjective, I think, to the organization. And especially if they're doing application development, things like that, like they're going to have different objectives and goals than someone who might be using SaaS products. So yeah, I would highly recommend bringing in a risk advisor.
Yeah, I mean, I can't emphasize what she said enough. It's like, it's a journey. It's a different thing for each organization. Like, you don't just jump from being a startup to being like, Netflix and having Chaos Monkey going around breaking things.
Right.
It's a process. It's a spectrum. So start where you are. Make sure you have the right folks involved to help you, for sure.
I'm listening to all this and going, so ISO 27, SOC 2 Type 2 doesn't mean I'm secure. Is that what you're saying?
Oh.
It's a good thing. It's a good thing to look to, right?
It's a great place to start.
Yeah.
It's a great place to start.
I think we've made a few friends over here as well. I've got Robert here who mentioned that he failed CISP twice, and CISSP twice. Was a tough journey, but I learned so much. Eventually passed and made some great connections along the way. Actually, that's a good one. Yeah, you get to make friends along. Yeah, yes. I failed. I mean, I guess we're already friends over here, but I think it's definitely you're in a good group, Robert.
I failed I'm happy to raise my hand and say I failed the CISSP the first time too. I thought I knew exactly what I was going into. I walked in, got the questions, and I was like, oh my gosh, I was not prepared. I was not prepared at all. But then I went and took it the second time, and I felt great. Felt great the second time, passed the second time, no problem. So, it happens. It certainly happens.
Oh yeah, it definitely does. And I'm so glad we could open up that conversation. I think Chris, what you mentioned about the LinkedIn thing as well. When you see people come in and they update their status, like I got certified in Azure, AWS, CISP, and everything else, and just get like hundreds of likes in there. And I feel bad for like whoever doesn't have that certification and probably is too young, I guess, to be affected by it, I guess. And there you go, like, oh my God, I just feel for those folks who are just going to sit through multiple attempts of these exams. But there is hope at the end of the
Absolutely.
End of the tunnel.
I was going to say, I think there's also like a hunger out there for people to be honest. Like I failed the Azure security exam before I passed that one as well. And I made a LinkedIn article about what I learned by failing, like all the things I learned about Azure security while failing the exam. And I actually made it into like a Marco checklist, his distribution that he has.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It really picked up and resonated with people, just being honest about the process. And, it's part of the process.
I think funny enough, right? I think as a society, we are definitely going into a path where it's all about accolades. It's all about how amazing we are, rather than, hey, this is what I learned from failing. So talking about failing, it just reminded me of another thing that you guys touched on, which I found really fascinating as well. The RTO RPO conversation, right? Do you feel like are there like AWS tools, or is that quote unquote cloud, can they be cloud native? I guess, is it easier to design if it's cloud native? If I want to say RTO of 5 minutes, so design architecture around it, would that be easy enough? And then that can comply with my vulnerability strategy as well. Is that possible?
I think there's definitely some native capabilities that like we couldn't do on premise and legacy infrastructure and architectures on premise, like leaning into like, S3 cross region replication, for example, like, or some of the DynamoDB, replication capabilities that they have, for example. That's just stuff that you just couldn't go in and click a couple of things on premise and all of a sudden your data is going to, cross regions across the continent kind of scenario. So there's definitely some native services to lean into that I think can help there for sure.
Awesome. And what about vulnerability management then as well? At least I don't know of any vulnerability scanner, but
AWS Inspector.
Yeah. So Inspector, and there are, like I said, I'm pretty sure Inspector has different tiers as well. So there's different, you can sort of tailor your environment to kind of what you can kind of pay for and kind of what you're expecting. You can always use other tools. Let's say you have, for example, Tenable already in your on-premise environment and you want to leverage it in your AWS deployment. You can as well. You can set up a scanner, go ahead and scan the environment and sort of start there. So you can use the tools you already have if you're not quite ready to deploy new tools or use, cloud native tools. So there are a number of options available.
Awesome. Yeah, because I think there's this forum that I'm part of. We regularly often talk about the fact that how some of the existing tools were designed for on-premise, and when you try and move them into a cloud, there's a bit of a bit of a learning curve there as well. So I'm not gonna open that Pandora's box right now. But
I was gonna say that would take us another hour.
Yeah, that's why I'm gonna hold off on this. But I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm pretty sure everyone else did as well. I think we had about 60 people so far, so that's pretty awesome. They've been logging in, and so I'm thinking in the information for anyone else who's probably going to join in. I'm pretty sure they'll love to hear more about this. So where can they get to hear your podcast? I'm assuming Apple, Spotify, but I'm going to let you guys talk about this. I do appreciate the time you guys spend with us, and I would love for them to know where they can hang out with you guys and where can they find the podcast.
Yeah, I'll say in terms of the podcast, you can find us pretty much like anywhere podcasts are available. It's through Apple Podcast, Spotify are the two big ones. Apple Podcast seems to be where everyone listens for the most part, but it also distributes to other channels as well. And then, where can you find me? LinkedIn. I'm always on LinkedIn talking to people. That's how I met Ashish. That's how I met Nikki. I love the community around cybersecurity on LinkedIn, so you can definitely find me there anytime.
Yep, same here. I'm on LinkedIn. That is certainly my primary area that I'm at. It's Dr. Nikki Robinson at LinkedIn. That's it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
As we said that, I think there was a delayed response from questions, but there are a few questions coming in as well. Do you mind if I take a couple of minutes?
No, sure.
Hey, Roshit. This is hello everyone. First time here. I'm late. Hoping to make it next time. We'll definitely see you next time, Roshit. Roxanne has a question. What is the best way to do patch management in AWS?
You want to go ahead? Okay.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, best way is subjective. It honestly depends on your organization, your competencies, your skills, like what kind of things you already have in place around processes and things like that. But with that said, I did mention earlier the native service AWS Systems Manager, Patch Manager. That's something you can lean into to, kind of get a governance and standardized way of patching, whether you have a schedule that works for your organization around, disruptions or, maybe downtime, things like that. So lean into that native service, check it out, see what it can do for you.
Yep, and I think also depends on the kind of compute you're using as well, right? I think to Nikki,
it doesn't cover every
containers.
Right. It don't.
I think Chris, you touched on the golden AMI as well. There's so many different ways to approaching it, but I guess hopefully that answers your question, Roxanne. But she's a regular listener as well. Thanks, Roxanne. All right, I think that's all the questions. Unless they show me more questions after this, it's like I'm not gonna hold you both for longer. But this episode is going to be live on the audio platform as on the Apple Podcast as well later tonight and before America wakes up. But next week is a new month, and we're starting with cloud native actually. So that's a perfect way to end this talking about cloud native. So thank you so much for coming in, and I am looking forward to having more of these conversations with both of you.
Awesome, thank you so much
for having us.
Thank you. All right, everyone. I'll see you next time then. See ya.